grateful to you guys. This is it's a bit of an endurance course sometimes. We go to about 22 hours course in 3 days. And we've got a recession on, and you probably noticed we haven't got as many people in as we have in previous years. But you guys have made it. You guys have come, and I'm really bloody proud of you. Thank you for sort of helping us do what we do, and what we do every year, and what I hope we'll carry on doing for many years to come. Now I'm going to introduce an old friend of mine, who I last saw. I mean, you'd never believe the man was a hippie. I mean, look at him. I haven't seen him since February. We went and saw Dr. Strangely Strange, and you can't get more hippie than that. What was really cool, we took Max to see Dr. Strangely Strange. Has anybody here actually heard of Dr. Strangely Strange? Yes. Okay, for those of you who don't know, they were the Irish equivalent of the Incredible String Band. They're probably the most obscure psychedelic, yeah, I think much better. A really obscure Irish psychedelic folk band, and we took Max. And Max loved them, didn't he? But I tell you what, Andy I'm sure will admit this. Didn't you get tears in your eyes to a strange lot?
Both eyes, when they played Ballad of the Wasps.
Oh, fantastic. We're just soppy old hippies. But anyway, enough of being a soppy old hippie. For the next hour, I hand you over. Oh, by the way, Andy, keep on forgetting to tell people. That means 10 minutes left, that means 5 minutes left, and that means you're overrun and get off the bloody stage. I'm passing you over to Richard. Hang on, which is the best microphone, Dave?
One Richard's got.
I'm handing you over to Richard, who will introduce. Richard, do the intro.
Andy Roberts' best friend is an androgynous and rather vainglorious elf called Jerry. And he's here tonight to talk about the domestication of the cormorant in China and Japan. Thank you very much, Andy Roberts.
Richard. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for coming to listen to my talk. I'd like to thank my makeup artist as well for the excellent job she's done this afternoon. The first time I've had my face painted since the Glastonbury Festival in 1979. I think there's something in the cream teas here that made me want to do it again. As you can see, my talk's called The Big Grey Man of Ben Macdouey and Other Mountain Panics. It's quite an intense talk, very wordy, and with very few pictures, so you will, I'm afraid, need to pay attention. Firstly, how many of you have heard of The Big Grey Man of Ben Macdouey? So, about half of you. Well, in that case, that's good, because you will have some knowledge. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a journey exploring the legend of the creature known as the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdouey. We start with notions of a physical, humanoid creature existing on the fringes of objective reality, but then, in the best tradition of supernatural inquiry, we'll end up somewhere completely different. Unfortunately, I'm going to be reading from notes. I'm sorry, but it's the only way I can get through this amount of information. I'll try to be reasonably coherent, but I do have to say some Gaelic names. I also have to say the phrase Big Grey Man of Ben Macdouey so many times that I will sometimes refer to it as a BGM for simplicity's sake. So, here we go. It's been called Britain's Yeti, which it's not. It's our very own Bigfoot, but it's not. And for the past 90 years or so, the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdouey has become a staple for those writing about Scottish legends. With the exception of the Loch Ness Monster and the Bonnybridge UFO hotspot, Big Grey Man is arguably Scotland's best known example of strange phenomena. You can see how the Big Grey Man has entered popular culture by this example. This is a very bad postcard that used to be on sale in the Cairngorms, the Big Grey Man's home. It does show how it entered popular culture and what the popular perception of the monster is, which is one of a Yeti-type creature which pursues people. So much has been written about the Big Grey Man that you might be tempted to believe it's a well-attested experience with hundreds of witnesses. If only it were that simple. When put under the microscope and taken away from the conventions of storytelling or the obligation to make a profit, the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdouey, like the majority of Fortean phenomena, takes on a completely different appearance. So, what exactly is the Big Grey Man and where is Ben Macdouey? As we'll see later, it doesn't really matter about the geographical location, but as the creature is named after a mountain, it might be nice to know where and what we're talking about. And from that somewhat khaki map of Great Britain, you can see that the Cairngorms in the top right-hand corner of Scotland, and that's where the big grey man lives. It's 1,309 metres high, is Ben Macdui, and is the second highest mountain in the UK. The Cairngorms are a high plateau with a subarctic climate, often covered in snow for months at a time. Quite a remote area for the UK, and just the sort of place that you might expect a yeti to hang out in. If you read the accounts of the literature, you'll discover witnesses to the big grey man phenomenon, describing how they have encountered loud footsteps, felt a sensation of presence, seen a giant hairy figure, and have been gripped by an overwhelming sense of panic, much like when you meet John for the first time. This collection of narratives has been hammered and forged by successive writers over the years until it has acquired the catch-all phrase of Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui. Besides being a staple of Scottish folklore, the Big Grey Man is now part of the international cryptozoological lore. Unfortunately, those who have written about it have, rather than investigate the matter, chosen to repeat the best bits of the legend and present it to the world as a real humanoid figure, such is the way of people who have to make their living from writing. You can see this particular picture is taken from Lauren Coleman's Field Guide to something or other, big animals or something. And as you can see, it's depicted as a Yeti-type creature, big hairy giant with a physical existence. Books which describe the Big Grey Man as being a physical creature without offering any evidence only serve to perpetuate the myth, however. The Big Grey Man experience, as we'll hear shortly from some accounts, is terrifying enough to compel witnesses to flee in absolute blind panic, often for several miles. Given that this takes place on rocky, dangerous ground, often in appalling weather conditions, we should not underestimate the power of the experience. Accounts and theories of the phenomenon have been detailed in numerous books, magazines and newspapers from 1925 to the present day. The Big Grey Man is so famous that it has even had a whole book written about it, which I thoroughly recommend. You probably won't find it in this edition though. But this book by Affleck Gray details every known fact about the Big Grey Man. It's got the best collection of accounts, but it's very thin on analysis, which is what drew me to investigate the Big Grey Man in the first place. I hate stories that are just left as legends, and I like to find out what the underlying stimuli is for them. With the Big Grey Man, I think I found it, and much more. In discussing the Big Grey Man, the researcher is immediately confronted with the problem of what exactly can be admitted as evidence for its existence, physical or otherwise. Affleck Gray's book lists numerous alleged encounters and draws in other supernatural phenomena in support of the creature. Gray also makes little distinction between first-hand accounts and anecdote and rumour. This heavy mix gives the impression that there are far more Big Grey Man encounters than there actually are. There is also the problem related to the geography of the mystery. Many encounters and experiences attributed to the Big Grey Man are not actually on Ben Macdui, but from the surrounding mountains and valleys. So the first step in any discussion of the Big Grey Man is to define what constitutes a Big Grey Man experience. My best definition, based on all the available information, is as follows. The core phenomenon consists of the following elements: a giant figure, the sound of loud, heavy footsteps, a sensation of terror or panic strong enough to cause the witnesses to want to get away as fast as possible, and the experience must have taken place on the mountain of Ben Macdui or in its immediate environs. Based on this definition, an analysis of the literature using primary and secondary sources reveals the following facts. Unfortunately, there are only 6 good, well-attested or first-hand accounts which fit the previous criteria. Of these, only 3 actually took place on or in the immediate vicinity of Ben Macdui, and only 2 of the 6 actually involve the witnesses seeing a Big Grey Man or similar figure. So you've got a whole legend and a book based on 2 sightings, one of which is actually a second-hand report. So bearing this in mind, let's look at the relevant source material. Despite rumour and belief that the Big Grey Man was seen frequently in the late 19th century, we have only one account which can be said to date from that period. This is the one given by Professor Norman Collie of his 1891 experience. The experience is the one most often quoted by writers on the subject, and the one which brought the Big Grey Man to the attention of the general public. Blank slide just for amusement's sake. This is Collie, a fascinating character, professor of organic chemistry, a climbing contemporary of Aleister Crowley, and a keen all-weather mountaineer. As a scientist, Collie was involved closely with the discovery of the gas neon and was responsible for taking the first X-ray for surgical purposes. In short, he was no fool. He first publicly recounted his frightening experience on Ben Macdui at the annual dinner of the Cairngorm Club on November 28th, 1925. His account was as follows, and I've put all these text accounts on slides so you can read them as well as listen to my droning Yorkshire accent. I was returning from the cairn on the summit in a mist when I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, and then another crunch, as if someone were walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on, and the eerie crunch, crunch, crunch sounded behind me, I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearly down to the Rothiemurchus forest. Whatever you make of it, I do not know, but there is something very queer about the top of Ben Macdui, and I will not go back there by myself. The thing to bear in mind there is no big grey man. He didn't see anything, he just heard something and was seized by a sensation of panic. And yet it's that account which is the foundation for the entire legend. Oh, that's not logging yet. If you read accounts of Collie's experience, you'll find several authors state categorically that he saw the big grey man. But you'll note, as we've just seen there from his own words, that he didn't. So the first big grey man sighting wasn't actually a sighting at all, but rather a sensing. But of what exactly? For all his science, Collie was not a reductionist, and he well understood the atmospheres created by wild places. Years prior to his Ben Macdui experience, he wrote, "There are places that one dreads, where one trembles and is afraid, one knows not why, and one's fears stand in the way." In a discussion of Collie's big grey man experience, his biographer concluded that, quote, "Collie remained emphatic, something beyond the wit of man haunted that mountain." The second major account of the big grey man originates from Dr. Henry Keller's. His account was submitted by a friend to the letters page of the Aberdeen Press and Journal in December 1926 and reads, and you must remember this is the first-hand account, this is a story told to someone and then repeated. He and his brother had been chipping for crystals in the late afternoon well below the cairn and were together on the slope of a fold on the hill. Suddenly they became aware of a giant figure coming down toward them from the cairn. They saw it pass out of sight in the dip on the side of the fold, remote from themselves, and awaited its reappearance, but fear possessed them before it reached the top, and they fled. They were aware of it was following them, and tore down by Corrie Tachen to escape it. Mr. Keller said there was a mist on part of the hill, but refused to believe that the figure could be anything other than the shadow of either his brother or himself, causing an optical illusion. So this is the first recorded account of an actual sighting of a figure, but it's second-hand, so we don't actually know if that's true or whether it's a retelling of a story. What we do know is that whatever the Keller's brothers experienced, it was enough to make them so scared as to run several miles to escape it. The 1920s saw a huge explosion in alleged sightings of the big grey man. Scottish newspapers ran lurid stories of hairy terror on the mountain slopes, and big grey man sightings and theories were reported in the newspapers on an almost monthly basis over the next few decades. Sadly, the vast majority of these stories were either unsubstantiated or friend-of-a-friend stories or inaccurate rehashes of the Collie and Keller's experiences. In fact, we have to wait till the 1940s for the next significant big grey man event, when Alexander Tunian wrote an account of the big grey man for the Scots magazine. And you need to remember what he's saying here, because we'll come back to Tunian later. No, that's no, yes it is. Prior to writing this, he wrote, "Of all the experiences that have come my way, one stands out above all others in its strangeness. This is when I shot the big grey men of Ben Macdui. In October 1943, I spent a 10-day leave climbing alone in the Cairngorms, and I carried a revolver and ammunition to shoot any hares that came my way. One afternoon, as I reached the summit cairn of Ben Macdui, mist swirled across the Larrick Grew and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce, bitter wind whisked among the boulders, and, fearing a storm was imminent, I took hurriedly to the Corrie Tachen path. I was swinging along at about 5 miles an hour when an odd sound echoed through the mist, a loud footstep, it seemed, then another and another. I'm not unduly imaginative, but my thoughts flashed instantly to the well-known story of Professor Norman Collie and the Big Grey Man. Then I felt the reassuring weight of the loaded revolver in my pocket. Grasping the butt, I peered about in the mist, here rent and tattered by eddies of wind. A strange shape loomed up, receded, came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and hurried down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time I have never bettered since. You may ask, was it really the Big Grey Man? Frankly, I think it was. Tunian's experience is widely quoted, and rightly so. The fact that someone, a hardened soldier in this case, would be so scared as to pull a gun on the phenomenon and fire it gives considerable weight to the physical reality of the experience. Tunian's experience also contains all the criteria for a BGM event and cannot easily be explained in terms of an optical illusion. But bear what he said in mind. Another wartime Big Grey Man encounter took place in May 1945 when Peter Densham, at that time in charge of aeroplane rescue operations in the Cairngorms, was sat at the summit of Ben Macdui. After eating his sandwiches, he suddenly had the impression there was someone near me. After a little while, I had the impression of something cold on top of my neck. I stood up and was conscious of a crunching noise from the direction of the cairn on my left. I went forward to investigate this noise. When I got near to this cairn, I began to think of the Big Grey Man and his footsteps. Suddenly, I was overcome by a feeling of apprehension, and after a little while, my overpowering wish was to get off the mountain. I found myself running at an incredible pace, and then realised I was running in the direction of Lurcher's Crag. I tried to stop myself, and found this was extremely difficult to do. It was as if someone was pushing me. I ran down the ridge all the way to the Althmoor Bridge, and all the way past Glenmore, and I was right on the other side of the loch before I stopped running. Densham's account flags up several key points here. Most significantly, that although his experience is firmly established within the Big Grey Man lore, like Collie, he didn't actually see anything at all. Densham's experience consisted solely of feeling a presence and being gripped by a blind panic. As with other Big Grey Man witnesses, this fear was so compelling that it caused him to run blindly for several miles. His phrase, "I found myself running at an incredible speed," suggests he was fully aware of what was happening, yet so overpowered by it that he couldn't stop it. Finally, before I start to make some sense of the Big Grey Man phenomenon, here's another witness account. This one comes from Joan Grant, who some of you may know as the authoress of many books of historical fantasy fiction. It comes from a nearby area to the Cairngorms called Rothiemurchus Forest in the foothills of the Cairngorms and a few miles from Ben Macdui. Yet, as you will hear in a moment, it is very, very similar to the experiences of those who believe they have met the Big Grey Man on the mountain itself. Nothing could have been farther from my mind than spooks when suddenly I was seized with such terror that I turned in panic and fled back along the path. Leslie ran after me, imploring me to tell him what was wrong. I could only spare breath to tell him to run faster, faster. Something utterly malign, four-legged and yet obscenely human, invisible and yet solid enough for me to hear the pounding of its hooves, was trying to reach me. If it did, I should die, for I was far too frightened to know how to defend myself. I had run about half a mile when I burst through an invisible barrier behind which I was safe. I knew I was safe now, though a second before I had been in mortal danger. I knew it as though I was a toreador who had jumped the barrier in front of a charging bull. All the accounts I've given so far are typical of the so-called encounters with the Big Grey Man. Explanations as to what lie behind them have been tossed to and fro as interest in the Big Grey Man has waxed and waned. Books such as Affleck Gray's detail theories of origin, ranging from the Big Grey Man as a visitor from space, through to being a fairy-type elemental, to outright hoax or wild fantasy. No satisfactory evidence is ever put forward to back any of these claims, as with much of 14 phenomena, and they rest entirely on belief, speculation, and often wishful thinking. One of the main contentions, of course, is that the experiences are evidence of a physically real creature of the same type as the Yeti, Bigfoot, or Alma. I doubt this very much. Even being charitable with the evidence and accepting third and fourth hand accounts, it is almost 100% certain that the Big Grey Man is not a corporeal creature. Unlike many other cryptozoological creatures, there are no photographs, no bones, no droppings, no fur or skin samples, no evidence of any predatory action of the local mammal population, and so on. In fact, nothing other than narrative accounts. And even that is flawed, because big grey man experiences appear to be random in location and time. They don't happen to everyone who visits Ben Macdouey, nor do they happen to the same people twice. So to sum up the actual evidence for its existence, we've only got no evidence for the physical existence of the big grey man other than the witness statements exists. But there is evidence that there is a core panic to all this, a core panic experience, which is central to all big grey man experiences. And it's my belief that this is evidence of a hitherto unknown phenomenon, which I've called mountain panics. A careful analysis of witness experience seems to indicate that the big grey man experience is completely non-physical, spontaneous and transitory in nature. So what exactly is going on? Well, I'm not daft enough to say that people aren't having these experiences, because I firmly believe they are, and I firmly believe there are probably hundreds of people who've had the experience but have chosen not to report it for reasons that we'll see. Because of the complete lack of physical evidence, it would be easy to dismiss the big grey man legend as being nothing more than a few unusual experiences moulded by the media into a localised folk tale. But that would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Those who have met the big grey man have been experienced and tough mountaineers, yet what they encountered caused them to panic, to flee in terror and to risk their lives running miles over treacherous terrain. Something perhaps, physical or non-physical, must have caused these experiences. And that's where the whole subject gets very slippery indeed. Going back to the original witness statements then, a close reading reveals one underlying motif. As I've said before, all the witnesses reported some form of extreme, uncontrollable panic reaction, which led them to flee in blind terror, often for miles. This reaction is consistent throughout all the accounts, and in all the literature about supernatural or cryptozoological creatures, I've never come across any phenomenon that has had the power to make people react physically in the way that the big grey man does. Fair enough, you might say. Anyone would panic if they met the big grey man. But some of these panics actually take place before any visual sighting. And in the majority of the cases, the whole experience is solely a panic experience, with the other bits tacked on later. The trimmings of the big grey man legend are tacked on later by writers or witnesses, purely because of the geographical context. For instance, if someone had one of these experiences not on Ben Macdouey, they wouldn't say it was the big grey man, they would say it's something else, as we'll see very shortly. Unfortunately though, when reading accounts of the big grey man, the imagery of a big hairy hominid overrides all other aspects of the experience and creates the myth of the big grey man. So, is there a genuine mystery after all? Well, if the core phenomenon were isolated to the Cairngorms and the big grey man legend, we could justifiably discount it as an artefact of the storytelling process. But accounts of being gripped by an uncontrollable panic, one which results in fleeing to the point of exhaustion, intrigued me. So I dug deep in both the paranormal and mountaineering literature and discovered that this core panic experience is relatively widespread. In accounts found in the mountaineering literature, it is often briefly mentioned and then ignored. In accounts found in the supernatural literature, it is frequently subsumed into the more superficially exciting and marketable area of ghost stories. This is unfortunate because there appears to be a very real and separate phenomenon at work here. Oops, not that one. So, with the evidence for a physical big grey man being so sparse, but the evidence for the core panic phenomenon being so consistent and well evidenced, it would be a mistake to continue to see the big grey man phenomenon in either geographical isolation or in terms of being caused by an encounter with a genuine, real physical entity. The evidence I have gathered suggests the big grey man experience and others like it can be reframed as mountain panics, onto which local folklore is grafted, which, if you're still following me, leads me into some examples of similar panics, which, if they had been experienced on Ben Macdouey, would have undoubtedly have been interpreted quite differently. In May 1954, Clive Elliott, a waterboard surveyor, decided to walk the hills from Kilmuir to Staffin on the Isle of Skye. Everything was fine until he reached a stream in Glen Sneesdale. He jumped across and, immediately, as if I'd stepped into another world, my mind just went to pieces. I cannot describe the feeling, one of total, absolute, blind terror. I didn't look round to see what was happening, I just went up the hill, and I remember pulling myself against the grass, boosting myself as hard as I could. I've never felt anything like that in my life before, and please God, I never do again. The panic stopped after a few hundred yards, and Elliot's day continued without incident. But consider this, if his experience had taken place within the confines of Ben Macdui, his account would surely have become a key part of the overall legend. Perhaps there is something about Northern Skye, because the following account originates from within a few miles of his encounter. In June 1971, Brian Miller headed south from the Staffing to Eag Road. As he walked, he soon began to feel distinctly uneasy, intimidated and depressed, as though something was watching him. He continued, became increasingly convinced that something malignant was watching and waiting for a chance to spring. After another half mile, he descended into a small hollow and really felt fear, for all the world as if something were hiding behind the last rise and would spring if I took my eyes off the route I had taken. Miller turned and fled back to his car in panic. Once again, had this experience taken place in or near the Cairngorms, it would surely have become part of the Big Grey Man legend. Yet once again, there is no evidence of a physical cause to the phenomenon. Another correspondent, Mr. Craig, told me of an incident which took place on Ben Achee near Aberdeen. This is interesting because this is 3 people who had this experience. He and his 2 friends were resting below the summit when we all stopped talking and a most horrid feeling of unease and then absolute terror swept over us. As one person, the 3 of us fled down through heather, boulders, with no thought except get away, get away. They didn't stop running until they reached the foot of the mountain. There was no forewarning of this terror, and oddly, neither Craig nor his companions mentioned the experience to each other for years afterwards. There is a local legend of the giant of Ben Achee, a not dissimilar figure to the Big Grey Man, and the witness believes he may have encountered Jocko Ben Achee, as he is known, which is just really the legend of Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui transferred somewhere else to a similar experience, but not proof of anything physical. Sensations of a presence and extreme panic are clearly not restricted to the confines of Ben Macdui or the Cairngorms. I have gathered over 30 similar accounts from all over the world. Not a huge number, but it seems to be representative of many more, and of a class of supernatural experience which is not as yet clearly defined. It seems this experience can happen in any mountainous or wilderness area. They do not fall into any easy category, which makes their reporting difficult. After all, who wants to announce that they've been terrified to the point of running away by something they could not see? This factor doubles when you're dealing with hardened mountaineers who claim to be able to outstand any weather conditions or any privations whatsoever. They're hardly likely to pop it to the local police station and say they've been so frightened they had to run away. So therefore, I think these experiences are often ignored or go unreported. When they are reported, they often become subsumed into local folklore, attached to ghost stories, hauntings and so on. I'm also suggesting that the form given to the experience by a witness or commentator, i.e. that of a giant, ghost, fairy, elemental or whatever, supersedes the core panic phenomenon and becomes a sort of supernatural shorthand for the original experience. This makes for an interesting and original story, I think, but lays a false trail. Some of these mountain panics, like those in Ben Macdui and Ben Achee, have become attached to and synonymous with entities said to cause the panic. Some appear to be in clusters like those in Northern Skye, but remain unnamed, i.e. not yet attached to any particular legend or folktale. Others stand alone as one-off terrifying and baffling experiences. All the witnesses were profoundly terrified by their encounters with this unknown terror, and it seems there is a genuine mystery here. But once identified, even a possibly new genre of supernatural experience becomes just another story for the 14 equivalent of stamp collectors, unless some attempt is made to determine a cause or put the phenomenon in context. As several of the experiences have taken place in the same general region, it's tempting to suggest that the origin for the experience is possibly caused by something in that area. This idea of certain areas being haunted is a classic Fortean one, and they're often known as window areas or devil spots. The Earth Mysterious Fraternity has been saying for decades that unspecified Earth energies can cause all kinds of experiences, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the works of people like Paul Devereux. Archaeologist and dowser Tom Lethbridge, who again many of you will be aware of, also thought so, and referred to the cause of these experiences as ghouls. His wife experienced one of these ghouls at Ladram Bay in Devon and had the sensation as if someone or something was urging her to jump over the edge of the cliff. Shades here of the panics detailed so far. Lethbridge attributed this phenomenon to a place field caused by underground water producing changes in the Earth's magnetic field and thus affecting the brain of anyone who happened to be in the right place at the right time. And perhaps it is these hard to define and somewhat nebulous Earth energies which lie at the root of the Big Grey Man experience, but critics will have none of it. Even the kindest would say that this is just replacing old folk tales with New Age techno-folklore, claiming that allegations of energies are rooted in unverifiable narrative and untenuous scientific evidence. There is no doubt that the forces of natural radiation and electromagnetism exist, and it is reasonable to speculate that they can have an effect on consciousness. However, with or without the acceptance of such fringe theories, there are other ways of looking at the causation and interpretation of the Big Grey Man and other mountain panics. Being among mountains and other wild places is often an awe-inspiring experience, where the difference between the natural and the supernatural is often merely a matter of perception. Perhaps senses stretched by exertion, heightened by beauty and isolation, can create psychological phenomena which causes panic of the type I'm outlining here, and therefore attaches legends to it. But this sort of reductionist psychology is the last thing you want to hear about at a weird weekend. And equally, perhaps the psychologists are all wrong, and there are other reasons for the Big Grey Man. In his book, Gulfs of Blue Air, Cairngorm writer Jim Crumley revives an age-old belief when he states that mountains, quote, accommodate the gods of the ancients. Perhaps this is a clue. In the Western world in the 21st century, it's our predilection as a society to interpret any unknown experience as either psychological or paranormal in nature, as if either of those designations actually explains the experience. We frequently, in fact, use one explanation to explain another, and these explanations change with the times and with the fashions, as Charles Fort said. The nature-based cosmologies of our ancestors would have had no problem in categorising the experiences I am recounting today. They were animists and believed that every facet of the landscape had its presence and was the personification of a god or spirit known as the genius loci. Any anomalous or visionary experience would have been easily interpreted as belonging to a particular rock, tree, valley, mountainside, etc., and symbolised in a form relevant to local mythology or folklore. Whether the experience was repeated or not, the idea of the genius loci in inhabiting one particular area would become embedded in and handed down through the local tradition. My dictionary defines genius loci as, quote, the spirit dwelling in a particular spot or the characteristic atmosphere of a place, and I think that might sound familiar. The Big Grey Man and the Giant of Ben-Aki and all the other mountain panics could well be described as genius loci, still being experienced irrespective of any pre-existing traditions concerning them. Some, such as the Big Grey Man, having attracted names and traditions, others, like those on the island of Skye, as yet nameless. So perhaps these mountain panics are the direct experience of the location's genius loci. It's an attractive thought, but just as unprovable a concept as the Earth energies theory, or as pointless as a reductionist psychological viewpoint. Mountain panics, so-called Earth energies, and any type of visionary experiences can also be seen as metaphors for spontaneous psychic or psychological experiences, which in this context are in turn themselves metaphors for any experience which the human consciousness comes up against and can't explain. And here I don't mean, say, coming up against nature as we know it aesthetically through art or literature, or even nature as in the form of a scientific understanding by biology, botany and so on. All those are just temporary modes of describing, not of experiencing. I'm referring to it in the terms that Nan Shepherd, famous Scottish writer, did when she refers to the experience of nature in the raw, a primitive thing and utterly baffling. An elemental experience genuinely beyond any form of human explanation and therefore only describable in metaphor. To even begin to understand that, we must go back to the accounts of the experiences of the BGM and other mountain panics and to the core phenomena, which is one of terror or blind panic. The word panic derives, of course, from the Greek god Pan. According to one book on mythology, Pan is described as the feeling of solitude and lonesomeness which weighs upon travellers in wild mountain places was ascribed to the presence of Pan, and thus anxiety and alarm arising from no visible or intelligible cause came to be called panic fear. And that, I think, is a description which pretty much describes all the Big Grey Man accounts and other mountain panics I've described so far. Another source when describing Pan noted that, quote, the apparent form is symbolic rather than representational of any physical entity. The elemental archetype is often more sensed than seen. All descriptions and encounters with Pan speak of the same criteria and phenomena: lonely, often mountainous or wilderness areas, the core panic phenomenon being randomly triggered and frequently experienced or later described as a physical entity which isn't really there, all of which sounds familiar. So, have all the witnesses to mountain panics actually met Pan? And isn't that just another bonkers explanation anyway? Well, in dealing with the supernatural, we're constantly forced to describe the indescribable. And I think the clue here is to get away from notions of physical entities, nature spirits, earth energies and so on as being in any way objectively real, and to look at panics and the pan experience as just probably the best metaphor for the interpretation of nature when it overrides our normal waking experience. And I think that the best and clearest synthesis of this panic experience, and one with the most relevance, is that given by Jungian analyst James Hillman, who wrote, "Panic is a direct participation in nature, a fundamental experience of the world alive and in dread. Objects become subjects, they move with life while one is oneself paralysed with fear. When existence is experienced through instinctual levels of fear, images take on a compelling life of their own. The imaginal is never more vivid than when we are connected with it instinctually. The world alive is, of course, animism. That this living world is divine and imagined by different gods with attributes and characteristics is polytheistic pantheism. Nature alive means Pan, and panic flings open a door into this reality." And I think this is an apt description of exactly what does happen when all the big grey man and mountain panics are stripped down to their core. In remote areas, the solitude, exertion and often overpowering awe of the surroundings, together with the awareness, consciously or subconsciously, of being a fragile entity in an awesome and ultimately noble landscape, could be said to overpower the rational ego. The objects, i.e. the physical environment and its contents, become subjects, and so mist becomes a big grey man. Areas of landscape become threatening and later mythologised. Noises assume and infer supernatural origin, and nature in its myriad forms is encountered directly, without mediation. Human consciousness is just not prepared for this, and panic results. The witness, or should we say experiencer, physically fleeing until the spell is broken. Now remember back to what I said about 20 minutes ago about Alex Tunian, the guy who shot the big grey man. Well, he gets mentioned a lot. Many writers use the quote that I read out there as an example of the big grey man is physically real, but very, very few bother to mention a later letter that he sent to Affleck Gray, in which he said, "To this day I am convinced that I saw something, but I am equally convinced that that something was just a towering wisp of mist, which I imagined to be a menacing ghost. For on that day I am convinced I shot the only big grey man my imagination will ever see." So, what triggers this powerful elemental experience? Well, as we've seen, it could be all or any of the energy theories put forward by writers such as Paul Devereux, and whilst there remain a possibility for the trigger, we need not even invoke mysterious energies as the cause of these panics, as the following episode, again from the Cairngorms, near Ben McDewey, illustrates. "I was coming home around 1 o'clock on the Ravone Road when my nerves suddenly gave way. It was a fine winter's night, fairly clear, and I was belting along when it suddenly hit me. Exactly what triggered it off, I don't know. Maybe the call of a vixen or a wildcat, the hoot of an owl or the bark of a roebuck. Anyway, I trembled. I ran, looking over my shoulder till I got home in the small hours, soaked with perspiration. A doctor told me it could happen to any fit man, and he could not account for it. That experience occurred to a forester named Marshall, a man with a long experience of remote areas in the Cairngorms. Like most of the other witnesses, he was a hardened mountain man, knowledgeable about, yet sceptical of local ghost lore. In other areas of Fortean study, such as ghost hunting or ufology, these witnesses would have their credentials as sceptical, competent observers used to support an objective reality for their experience. But that's the myth of the credible witness. Unfortunately, we're all fallible and susceptible, and like the doctor said, it could happen to any fit man, and apparently does. Fans of the more occult explanations for mountain panics and their like may like to consider Marshall's remedy for this form of supernatural experience. On returning home, he, quote, stripped to the buff, had a good rub down, swallowed a stiff dram and lashings of tea and slept till like a log till 7 o'clock. Who needs exorcist, psychologist or shaman when you've got a cup of tea? Irrespective of whether these experiences are caused by the mind suddenly glimpsing the immensity of nature, or whether they are caused by external forces in nature, they amount to the same thing. A direct experience of the overpowering forces of nature, to be fled from, to be personified as the big grey man, a giant, the devil, ghosts, fairies, genius loci, to be feared, worshipped, or whatever, but not ignored. As a final example of the random nature of these mountain panics and how they can affect others, consider author John Buchan's comments and experience, and I'm sure you all know Buchan as being the author of many books, including the 39 Steps. We do not hear much today of the goat-foot god, but the experience which was the basis of the myth does not go unrecorded. In wild places or in wild weather, men are still awed by a sense of the immensity and pitiless of nature. In such moments, one sees, or at any rate feels, what the ancients meant by Pan. Buchan relates an experience from 1911 in the Bavarian Highlands, when returning from a mountain summit, he noticed his guide had fallen silent, and glancing at him was amazed to see that his face was dead white, that sweat stood in beads on his forehead, and that his eyes were staring ahead as if he were in agony of fear, as if terror were all around him, so that he dared not look one way rather than the other. Suddenly he began to run, and I ran too, some power not myself constraining me. Terror had seized me also, but I did not know what I dreaded. We ran like demented bacchanals, tearing down the glades, leaping rocks, bursting through thickets, colliding with trees, sometimes colliding with each other, and all the time we never uttered a sound. At last we fetched up beside the much-frequented highway, where we lay for a time utterly exhausted. For the rest of the road home we did not speak, we did not even dare to look at each other. Buchan concluded, what was the cause? I suppose it was panic. Sebastian had seen the goat-foot god or something of the kind, and he had made me feel his terror. This experience is very much like Mr. Craig's experience on Ben Aki, even down to the fact of the witnesses not discussing the event afterwards. We've come a long way in a short space of time, from the possibility that odd experiences on a Scottish mountain may have been caused by a yeti-like creature, to a core of experiences I have termed mountain panics. I'm making no claims for any absolute truth here, and for all you know, I might just be having a laugh. I mean, would you take anyone with a face like mine seriously? But all I can say for certain about my research into the Big Grey Man and other mountain panics is that the core experience appears virtually identical in all cases, and based on the evidence, I think this is a very real phenomenon, and one which may lie at the root of many supernatural experiences. Its triggers may be many, but they all stem from the brain's interaction with the environment. The bottom line is, as often the case, there is no physical monster behind the Big Grey Man, and as one commentator wrote to Affleck Gray, the most mysterious thing to be found among mountains is the human brain. So to sum up, it is my belief then, based on extensive research, that the Big Grey Man is a legend, one based on a primal human experience coupled with the mysteries of perception and belief, and spun by folklore into a convenient story. I actually think that most forms of supernatural experience stem from this mixture of elements. And in the end, we can only speculate. It's entertaining and informative, but only the witnesses who have experienced these panics, only those who have met the Big Grey Man and its brethren know for sure what it is like and what the experience means to them personally. There is a vast gulf of experience between those who know and those of us who speculate. The world, the multiverse, is a strange and mysterious place. A place where the natural can easily become the supernatural, where you can never quite know what you're going to encounter. I'll leave the last words on the Big Grey Man of Ben Macdui to mountaineer Richard Frere. Though your nerves be made of steel, and your mind says it cannot be, you will be acquainted with that fear without a name, that intense dread of the unknown that has pursued man from the very dawn of time. Thank you. If anyone's got any questions, yell them out.
Have you experienced anything like that yourself?
And where's that question coming from?
Over here.
I can see you. Oh, there you are. No, not like that, but when I do a lot of walking, and when I've been walking in wild places by myself, I've felt the beginnings of that sort of experience, if you like, where if I wasn't sort of focused on not freaking out, I could see how that can happen and how it can spiral out of control. But I've never had anything spontaneously just arise which has led me to run in fear.